It began with fire, not with applause. In the dusty August heat of Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré ordered something that stunned the world. Every genetically modified mosquito created under a $170 million project funded by Bill and Melinda Gates must be destroyed. Every lab sample dismantled, every test halted. Overnight, a nation that the global health establishment expected to quietly obey instead roared, "We will not be your laboratory." On paper, the science looked like genius. By rewiring the DNA of Africa's deadliest mosquito, Imperial College London promised a revolution in the fight against malaria: fewer females, fewer bites, fewer deaths. But to many Africans, the scheme triggered painful memories of cotton. Once called Burkina Faso's pride turned into international shame after GMO trials ruined its quality. Of small farmers trapped in debt by patented seeds of generations who felt their bodies and their futures had been signed away without consent. And so, a single act of defiance ordering the destruction of Bill Gates's mosquitoes became more than a health decision. It became a line in the sand, a reminder that sovereignty is not just about borders or flags, but about seeds, food bodies, and the very script of life itself. Now, the question is no longer scientific, it is moral. Why are experiments that could alter nature forever being tested first on Africa's soil? Who decides what risks a people must carry? And do we believe the promises of billionaires more than the scars of history? For those of us watching from afar, this story asks us to look deeper. Is Ibrahim Traoré a reckless nationalist, or the only leader with the courage to say no when the world expects silence? Please share if you believe that Africa must never again be treated as a testing ground. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than polished headlines. And let me know in the comments. Should we trust Bill Gates's laboratories or the defiance of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré? The story begins in the skies of Burkina Faso. On August 11, 2025, a small batch of mosquitoes engineered in European laboratories to produce mostly male offspring was quietly released above the villages of West Africa. Scientists called it a pilot study. They said it was safe, that it was not a full gene drive. They reassured local communities that these insects would help end malaria, the ancient disease that has haunted Africa for centuries. But just 1 week later, on August 18th, everything changed. President Ibrahim Traoré, a man who has built his young leadership on protecting the sovereignty of Burkina Faso, ordered the unthinkable: stop the project, destroy the samples, dismantle the entire operation. No hesitation, no compromise. Laboratories that had been built with millions of dollars in foreign funding were told to shut down. Decades of planning, patents, and community engagement meetings evaporated in a single stroke. This was not just a small research project. It was part of Target Malaria, one of the world's most ambitious scientific efforts to fight disease through genetic engineering. Since 2005, over $170 million had been poured into it, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation contributing at least $155 million. And Open Philanthropy adding more than $17 million. Burkina Faso was supposed to be the showcase, the first country to prove that genetically modified mosquitoes could work on a large scale. Scientists from Imperial College London held the patents, the technology, and the intellectual property. African labs and universities were given the role of breeding and releasing insects, but not of controlling the DNA edits themselves. For the project's supporters, this was the future, high-tech, innovative, a clever weapon against a disease that still kills over 600,000 people every year, mostly African children. For the critics, it was something else entirely, a dangerous experiment on human lives and fragile ecosystems, conducted far away from the countries that actually designed it. Traoré's order shocked not only the scientists, but also the global health community. Why would a nation that suffers deeply from malaria reject what seemed like a miracle solution? The answer, as many Burkinabe explained, was written in scars that were still fresh. The memory of genetically modified cotton still lingers. Introduced with heavy promotion from Monsanto and backed by Gates Foundation, funding Burkina Faso's cotton industry, once called the pride of the nation, collapsed after GMO seeds degraded fiber quality. By 2016, the government abandoned GMO cotton entirely, citing massive economic losses and international rejection of its exports. Cotton had accounted for nearly 60% of Burkina Faso's export earnings. Its failure meant millions of dollars lost and thousands of farmers driven into poverty. This memory made the release of genetically modified mosquitoes feel less like innovation and more like déjà vu. The pattern was painfully clear. New technology promised liberation, but in practice it brought dependency and destruction. Intellectual property stayed in Europe. Corporate profits stayed in the West. The risks, the failures, and the humiliation stayed in Africa. So when Traore intervened, it was not just a rejection of mosquitoes. It was a rejection of history repeating itself. He chose to act before Burkina Faso could once again be left carrying the burden of someone else's modernization. He chose to say enough. The consequences were immediate. For the Gates Foundation, it was a dramatic setback in a project they had invested in for nearly 2 decades. For scientists, it was a warning that Africa would no longer silently accept being the testing ground for technologies conceived abroad. And for ordinary Africans, it was a moment of vindication, a leader finally echoing what many had whispered for years: "We are not your lab rats." This act also raised deeper questions that go far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Can genetic engineering be trusted when its control lies in the hands of foreign institutions? Can sovereignty survive if the most intimate parts of life, food seeds, even insects, are owned by patents abroad? And why, if this science is so safe, is it not first tested in the neighborhoods of London or New York, but in the fragile villages of Africa? The story of August 2025 is not just about insects. It is about dignity, memory, and the refusal to let history repeat itself. In stopping the release of mosquitoes, Traore stopped something larger: the silent erosion of Africa's right to decide its own future. The tension reached its highest point in mid-August when Burkina Faso's skies became the stage for a global controversy. For the scientists at Imperial College London, the release of male-biased mosquitoes was a milestone, a cautious first step toward a world without malaria. They spoke of DNA rewiring as though it were a simple trick: alter the sex ratio, reduce biting females, and the disease slowly fades away. In their presentations, it sounded clean, efficient, almost elegant. But on the ground in Africa, the reaction was anything but calm. Farmers, activists, and elders did not hear the word innovation. They heard experiment. They did not hear safety. They heard risk. And above all, they asked one burning question: why Africa? That single question turned a scientific pilot into a political earthquake. Communities recalled how the actual gene editing was done not in Ouagadougou, not in Bamako, not in Nairobi, but in London. They remembered how patents and intellectual property remained in Western hands, while Africans were expected to carry the ecological consequences. To many, the mosquitoes symbolized not progress, but a familiar pattern: outsiders invent, outsiders profit, and Africa pays the price. The government's intervention on August 18th became the breaking point. When Traore ordered the destruction of every lab sample, his decision carried more weight than the insects themselves. It was an act of sovereignty delivered in full public view. The world's richest philanthropist had invested millions, and one of Africa's poorest countries said no. That defiance sent shockwaves. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was electric. In villages where the mosquitoes were supposed to be studied, relief mixed with pride. Farmers who had watched cotton collapse under GMO seeds finally saw a leader willing to listen. Young activists, often dismissed as conspiracy theorists, felt vindicated. Radio talk shows buzzed with callers praising the president as the defender of our bloodlines. Religious leaders described his decision as a moral stand protecting God's creation from being rewritten. Outside Burkina Faso, the voices split sharply. Regional groups like COPAGEN, a coalition of West African civil society organizations, applauded loudly. They had long campaigned under the slogan, "We will not be your guinea pigs." Nigerian activist Mariam Bessie declared, "We refuse exterminator technologies. If the West wants them, let the West test them first." But in Western capitals, the reaction bordered on disbelief. For institutions accustomed to African governments quietly signing off on foreign-funded projects, the rejection was a humiliation. Officials at Imperial College stressed that the release was limited, not dangerous, and fully approved by Burkina Faso's biosafety agency. Health experts warned that halting the project could delay global progress against malaria. Yet even as they defended their science, they could not explain why trust was collapsing so rapidly. Media coverage reflected the divide. African outlets highlighted the historical scars cotton ruined, farmers trapped in debt, biodiversity lost. Western outlets tended to frame the story as a setback in the fight against malaria, minimizing the sovereignty dimension. On social media, hashtags like "Mar, not your lab," and "Africa is not a guinea pig" spread rapidly, especially among youth in Mali, Ghana, and Nigeria. And then came the symbolic punch that made this moment a climax. Traore's government did not merely pause the project, it ordered destruction. Not storage, not suspension, but destruction. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would not keep even the possibility of resuming. In an age where billionaires often seem untouchable, this act of defiance burned like a flare across the continent. The emotions ran deep because the story of Mosquitoes tapped into something larger than health. It evoked the bitter memory of GMO cotton that once accounted for 60% of Burkina Faso's exports before collapsing. It reminded farmers how promised miracle seeds left them poorer and more dependent. And it resonated with women who still remembered sterilization campaigns disguised as healthcare. That is why the mosquito experiment ignited such fury. It was not only about malaria, it was about control over seeds, over bodies, over the genetic future of a continent. The sight of genetically edited insects drifting into African skies felt like a replay of old betrayals, this time at the molecular level. And so, in August 2025, the climax was reached. Science met history, philanthropy met sovereignty. And in that collision, Burkina Faso chose to burn bridges rather than risk repeating its scars. The international community may call it reckless. But for many Africans, it was the first time in years they felt a government stood on their side, refusing to let them be reduced to test subjects in someone else's grand design. When the order came to destroy the mosquitoes, it was not just a laboratory decision, it was a political thunderclap. The fallout rippled across every layer of society in Burkina Faso and far beyond. For ordinary citizens, the immediate feeling was relief. In rural villages, mothers told local radio they could finally sleep without fearing mutant insects biting their children. Farmers who still remembered the painful collapse of Burkina Faso's cotton industry said this decision spared them another round of humiliation. Cotton once accounted for 60% of the nation's export earnings. When GMO seeds from Monsanto degraded the fiber quality, Burkina Faso's global reputation shattered. Buyers refused its cotton, farmers lost millions, and the government abandoned GMO crops by 2016. Those scars had never healed. The destruction of the mosquitoes felt like closing the door before history could repeat itself. Yet relief quickly turned into deeper debate. Universities and civil society groups held forums asking whether Africa could ever truly control its science if patents stayed locked in London or Geneva. Some professors praised Traore's decision as an act of scientific decolonization, insisting that sovereignty meant controlling not just armies or borders, but genetic technologies too. Others worried would rejecting international research isolate Burkina Faso from future medical breakthroughs. Politically, the move strengthened Traore's image as a defender of sovereignty. Across Ouagadougou, murals began appearing with slogans like "We are not guinea pigs" and "Burkina Faso decides its future." Supporters rallied outside parliament calling him the Lion of Africa. For a leader often criticized in Western media as authoritarian, the episode recast him domestically as a protector of people against invisible threats. But the international consequences were heavy. The Gates Foundation and Open Philanthropy, after investing nearly 2 decades and over $170 million, faced public embarrassment. Their vision of making Burkina Faso a global showcase collapsed in days. Diplomats quietly asked whether aid packages or research collaborations might now be reconsidered. For Western institutions, the rejection signaled a new era where African governments might not only resist foreign projects, but openly dismantle them. Civil society across Africa took notice. Activist networks from Nigeria to Kenya pointed to Burkina Faso as proof that saying no was possible. Groups campaigning against GMO maize in South Africa or pesticide imports in Ghana suddenly had a powerful example. If one of Africa's poorest countries could defy the Gates Foundation, then any country could. This emboldened grassroots movements and increased pressure on other governments to scrutinize international health and agricultural initiatives more closely. The political reverberations also touched Africa's alliances. Within the alliance of Sahel states, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Traore's defiance was celebrated as part of a broader struggle for sovereignty. It fit neatly with other acts of resistance, from expelling French troops to rejecting Western mining contracts. The message was consistent: sovereignty means taking back control at every level, even at the genetic code of life. However, the decision carried risks. Some in the health sector worried about losing global support in the fight against malaria, which still kills hundreds of thousands of African children each year. International donors might reduce funding, fearing their projects would be dismantled. Scientists trained in the Mosquito program feared their skills could now be wasted, leading to frustration among a new generation of African researchers. Still, for most citizens, the calculation was simple: better to be cautious than to gamble with the future. Burkina Faso had already seen what happened when foreign corporations promised prosperity through GMO cotton, only to leave the country poorer and dependent. This time, the government acted before the damage became irreversible. In the end, the destruction of mosquitoes was more than a health decision. It was a civil statement of dignity and a political declaration of independence. It reminded the world that sovereignty is not abstract. It is lived daily in the choices about seeds, food, and even the smallest creatures in the air. And for Burkina Faso, it became a rallying cry: never again will we allow others to gamble with our destiny. From Washington to Brussels, the news out of Ouagadougou was met with confusion and unease. In the West, the story was quickly framed as a setback in the fight against malaria, but the symbolism went far deeper. For the first time in decades, a small African nation had not only questioned the wisdom of global philanthropy, but openly dismantled one of its most expensive experiments. To American and European policymakers, the precedent was alarming. What if more countries began rejecting foreign-led projects, from vaccines to agriculture to digital surveillance? In the United States, reactions split along familiar lines. Public health experts, especially those connected to the Gates Foundation's vast network of partnerships, emphasized the loss of momentum against malaria. They argued that with more than 600,000 annual deaths worldwide, mostly African children, rejecting genetic innovation could slow progress toward eradication. Editorials in major outlets suggested that Burkina Faso was succumbing to fear and misinformation, echoing older narratives that portrayed African resistance as irrational. But beyond the scientific establishment, other voices in America saw something different. Commentators skeptical of big tech and billionaire philanthropy pointed to the episode as evidence of overreach. They asked, why should private foundations, no matter how wealthy, be allowed to decide which populations are used for genetic experiments? Conservative critics drew parallels to domestic debates about corporate power and transparency, while progressive thinkers emphasized the echoes of colonial history, pointing out that experiments that could alter ecosystems forever were being tested first in Africa, not in Seattle or London. In Europe, the tension was even sharper. Imperial College London, at the center of the project, faced questions not only about science, but about ethics. Members of the European Parliament demanded to know whether EU-funded programs were complicit in exporting risky trials to the global south. Activist groups in France and Germany staged small protests under banners reading, "Africa is not your lab." For Europeans still grappling with their colonial past, the Burkina Faso rejection reopened old wounds about exploitation under the guise of progress. Meanwhile, in Africa, the symbolism resonated like wildfire. Leaders in Mali and Niger praised Traoré's stand as consistent with the new alliance of Sahel states' vision: sovereignty above all else. Civil society organizations from Nigeria to Kenya invoked Burkina Faso as proof that resistance was possible. Even in South Africa, where GMO crops dominate, debates intensified about whether corporate patents had left the nation trapped in a cycle of dependency. The Global South, too, watched closely. In India and Bangladesh, where debates over genetically modified foods and seeds remain heated, newspapers reported Burkina Faso's defiance as a cautionary tale. Latin American activists fighting pesticide giants cited Traoré's decision as inspiration. For many in the developing world, the incident confirmed what they had long suspected: that aid often comes with hidden costs, and that sovereignty sometimes requires saying no to powerful donors. Ultimately, the global perspective converged on one unsettling question: if Burkina Faso could halt a project backed by billions and championed by some of the most influential figures on Earth. What does that mean for the balance of power in science, aid, and politics? Was this the start of a broader African refusal to be the testing ground for foreign agendas, or an isolated act of defiance that might leave Burkina Faso isolated? For the United States in particular, the decision struck a nerve. Washington has long positioned itself as both a leader in global health and a defender of innovation. But Traoré's rejection revealed something uncomfortable: the moral authority of Western science is no longer unquestioned. For an older American audience watching this unfold, it raised haunting echoes of past controversies. Tuskegee experiments, sterilization campaigns, and other moments when the powerless bore the risks of someone else's progress. And so what looked like a local decision in a small West African nation became a mirror held up to the world. It forced Americans and Europeans alike to confront the question in the rush to engineer life itself, whose consent matters most. In the end, what happened in Burkina Faso was more than a scientific debate. It was a warning. A small nation often ignored by global headlines stood before the world and declared sovereignty cannot be traded for promises, no matter how polished. When President Ibrahim Traoré ordered the destruction of Bill Gates's genetically modified mosquitoes, he was not only halting a project, he was reclaiming a principle: Africa will not be reduced to a testing ground. The symbolism could not be clearer. These mosquitoes were never just insects. They represented a broader question that cuts to the heart of modern politics: who controls life, who decides which risks are worth taking, and whose bodies carry those risks. History has already answered too often at Africa's expense. From sterilization campaigns under colonial rule, to GMO crops that collapsed entire industries, to vaccine controversies that shattered trust, Africans have learned that the fine print of progress can carry invisible chains. But Burkina Faso's decision also forces us, whether in Africa, Europe, or America, to look at our own societies. If billionaires and private institutions can engineer life and release it into the world, what safeguards truly exist for any of us? If experiments cannot be reversed once unleashed, what accountability remains? These questions are no longer African questions. They are global questions. For older Americans who remember the Tuskegee experiments or forced sterilizations, the resonance is chilling. For Europeans still wrestling with colonial guilt, the pattern feels familiar. And for Africans, the lesson is clear: memory is not weakness. It is protection. Saying no today may be the only way to prevent scars tomorrow. Yet, the story is not finished. Malaria still kills hundreds of thousands each year. Hunger and agricultural dependency remain urgent crises. Rejecting unsafe or foreign-controlled technologies is only the first step. The harder task lies ahead: building African-led science, African-owned patents, and African-centered solutions that heal without exploiting. That is the deeper meaning behind Traoré's defiance. And so I leave you with this question. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies, his defense of food seed and even DNA sovereignty, are truly protecting Africa? Or do you think they risk isolating his nation from the world? Should we continue to trust the promises of global billionaires or support leaders who dare to say enough? Please share this video if you believe Africa must never again be a testing ground for someone else's experiments. Subscribe if you believe the truth should speak louder than headlines. And tell us in the comments. If faced with the same choice, would America or Europe have the courage to destroy the mosquitoes? Or is it only Africa that dares to defend life itself?